the one thing that's been most missing in evolutionary psychology was any adequate understanding of culture. And we're just starting to develop that, and literary study clearly comes in as a major contributor to that. And a beneficiary of that. There are various other ways in which the political and ideological motives entered into early evolutionary psychology and caused intellectual obstructions, conceptual, philosophical obstructions we're only just now finally getting past. They insisted, for example, on what's called the environment of evolutionary adaptedness, the Pleistocene of 1.6 billion years. They envisioned that as a static, monolithic, single framework of environmental causation that had produced a very specific pattern of the mind, and they developed an idea of human mental cognitive architecture as consisting of domain-specific cognitive modules, dedicated bits of neural machinery. So they conceived of the brain as sort of like a bundle with a bunch of little toolkits designed to do very specific things in the Pleistocene. It was an inadequate, false, misleading picture of the mind. I mean, it got to the correct idea that there are underlying regularities, there are deep consistencies in the human mind that has been shaped over time. But they eliminated the idea of domain general intelligence, flexible general intelligence, which is one of the most important distinguishing aspects of the specifically human mind. They de-emphasized individual variation, insisted on human universals, and thus eliminated really the central logic of evolutionary change, which is selection among variation. So there are various ways in which evolutionary psychology managed to put itself on the map institutionally and to create a certain amount of confusion while succeeding politically. Nonetheless, evolutionary psychology has had a real influence on everybody now who works in the whole field, even the people who've worked against some of the limitations in evolutionary psychology.
I think it's very important to establish for an audience of potentially interested readers, including especially those either teaching literature as a subject or studying it, that an evolutionary approach is not reductive, that it can be expansionist, that it can actually make you, as well as looking at larger perspectives, can also make you focus on the tiny details with more attention. I think it's always going to be a crucial part of any approach to literature to read closely, and if you don't read at least as closely as prior methods, then you're rather diminishing the field rather than adding to it. I've been working very closely with John Gottschall and Joe Carroll. We're all manically publishing books in the field. Joe Carroll being the person who really initiated the field back in 1995 with his book Evolution and Literary Theory.
When I wrote Evolution and Literary Theory, I got emphatically positive responses from people who were primed to respond positively. People who wanted to be thinking along those lines were ready to think along those lines. It became a rallying point for people who needed that kind of thing. It was ignored on a massive scale in mainstream literary studies. The people who were doing Marxism and post-structuralism kept doing it and simply didn't worry. I mean, they didn't feel the need even to respond to the challenge. But the people who wanted that did respond. Brian Boyd, for example, wrote an article in 1998 that had been largely sort of stimulated by that book. And John Gottschall said that when he opened Evolution and Literary Theory in his carrel at the university one day, his life changed, and so he knew here's something I can do. And I've been getting letters from people for years from the beginning saying, "Oh, this is thank you so much. This is exactly what I needed. It's such a relief to me to know that somebody can do this." And then, there's been a ripple effect. I mean, Brian's now a major influence. John's a major influence. I mean, a lot of people have moved out on their own.
people like Joe Carroll and John Gottschall and I, although we're all very, very strongly committed to an evolutionary approach to literature, have very different interests within that. Joe, for instance, is interested in a kind of model of human nature. That's a fundamental concern of his. It's not of mine. I think often fiction say we'll just chip away at one particular corner of human nature, or one particular thought experiment about human nature, but not necessarily engage the whole thing. John Gottschall, on the other hand, is become more and more interested in a kind of quantitative approach to literature, to trying to use the methods of the sciences. I think he's got a more skeptical attitude about the value of a great deal of literary scholarship than I have. I think that there's always been a lot of good literary scholarship. There's been a lot of intellectually corrupted literary scholarship over the last 20, 30, 40 years. But on the other hand, there have been others who've carried on with their good scholarly work in using good standards of evidence and argument. And I suppose I'm the most interested in applying evolutionary principles to particular texts in a critical way. So I'm very happy. Like in my latest book, I spend 6 chapters on the Odyssey and 5 chapters on a Dr. Seuss story, which seems like a lot. It's many thousands, or many times the number of words in the Dr. Seuss story.
There's this poem by Walt Whitman, When I Heard the Learned Astronomer. And it's this nice little story about Whitman sitting there and in a lecture hall and listening to the learned astronomer show that all these marvelous mysteries are sort of following this clockwork. And Whitman then goes out and looks out into the nighttime sky and sort of sighs, and something's been lost for the poet. But this is not what if you ask learned astronomers themselves, whether the beauty or the mystery has been decreased, it hasn't been, because new mysteries are birthed, for each one that is born. There's this old stereotype that the scientist is the murderer of beauty, the scientist is the murderer of art, and there's this concern. People say this to me, that what this is going to end up doing is destroying the humanities. That consilience is a bargain with the devil. I think they've got things backwards. Everything precious and wonderful and awe-inspiring about art is retained. Nothing's lost. If you, for instance, if you go into Emma, the novel, and you start extracting data from it, and you start using that data to address some questions you're interested in, it in no way degrades your experience of reading the novel. So it's this kind of strange idea to me as a scholar and intellectual, that by understanding something better, somehow you've degraded its beauty, or its whatever sort of traditional virtues people might apply to art.